Rook, stop!
Ethan Walker shouted, but the German Shepherd kept tearing at the cabin floor like he heard a voice trapped underneath.
It's just wood.
Rook barked harder. Rain battered the windows. Firelight jumped across Clara Whitcomb's empty room. Ethan dropped to one knee.
What did you find?
The board groaned loose. Beneath it sat something wrapped tight, hidden where no stranger would ever think to look. Ethan opened it only enough to see his name. His hands went still. Hollow Creek had buried the wrong secret with the wrong dog. But to understand why that box was waiting for him, you have to know why Clara Whitcomb brought Ethan back to that cabin in the first place. Ethan Walker had survived deserts, field hospitals, and the kind of nights that left grown men staring at nothing for years afterward. But there was something about Clara Whitcomb's cabin that made him feel like a boy again. Standing outside a closed door he was never meant to open. Rain crawled down the windows in thin silver lines. The old place sat alone beyond Hollow Creek, West Virginia, where the road turned to red mud and the pines leaned so close they seemed to whisper over the roof. Ethan had arrived before sunset with one duffel bag, a flashlight, a thermos of coffee gone bitter, and Rook, his 8-year-old German Shepherd, who now stood rigid beside the fireplace with his nose aimed at the floor. "It's an old house," Ethan said softly, more to himself than to the dog. Old houses make noise, but Rook did not look convinced. He was not the kind of dog that wasted fear. Before Ethan adopted him, Rook had searched floodwater, mudslides, and collapsed homes for people who still had a chance. He knew the difference between wind and warning. He knew when something living was trapped, and somehow tonight he seemed to know when something dead still had something to say. Ethan rubbed a hand over his face. At 46, Ethan had the guarded look of a man who had learned to sleep lightly, sit with his back to the wall, and carry wars no one else could see. Rook was the only creature who never asked questions. On bad nights, the dog would press his heavy head against Ethan's chest until the shaking passed. On good mornings, he would drop a cold nose into Ethan's palm as if reminding him that survival was not the same thing as living, but it was a place to start. Ethan looked toward the mantel. Clara's photograph sat beneath a veil of dust, silver hair, narrow shoulders, eyes turned away from the camera. He had been told to call her his grandmother, though she had never behaved like one. No warm hugs, no holiday fuss, no easy smiles. When Ethan was little, Clara watched him from doorways with a tenderness so restrained it almost looked like fear. He used to think she did not love him. Now she was dead, and her lawyer had sent one strange instruction with the deed to this cabin: spend one night here before selling it. The fire cracked. Rook growled, low, deep, not at the door, not at the windows, at the floor. Ethan straightened. Rook the dog stepped forward and scratched hard at a warped board near the hearth. Once, twice, then faster. Claws tearing at the wood until one nail split and left a thin red mark. Stop. Ethan caught his collar, but Rook pulled against him with a sharp, wounded whine. That sound went through Ethan like a memory. He had heard men make it under concrete, people trapped where no one could reach them. The almost sound people made when hope had become smaller than breath. Ethan let go. Slowly, he knelt and pressed his fingers to the board. It was colder than the others, slightly raised at one edge. He slid the tip of his knife beneath the raised edge and lifted slowly, careful not to break whatever the floor had been hiding. The wood resisted, then gave with a tired groan. Beneath it was a narrow hollow wrapped in black plastic. Inside sat a metal box sealed tight, hidden with care. Ethan lifted it out, but he did not open everything. The latch gave just enough to reveal the edge of a yellowed envelope and the cloudy band of a hospital bracelet before his hands went still. Across the envelope, Clara had written a sentence that made the room tilt. For Ethan, when you are ready to know why I had to become your grandmother. For the first time all night, he forgot to check the windows. He forgot the storm. He forgot the old rules that kept him alive. Because whatever Clara had buried beneath this floor had just reached up and taken hold of his life. 2 weeks before Rook found the metal box beneath Clara Whitcomb's floor, Ethan Walker was still living behind a garage in Charleston, West Virginia, pretending that routine was the same thing as peace. The garage belonged to a man named Bill Mercer, who had known Ethan's adoptive father years ago and never asked questions he didn't want answered. It was a narrow brick garage between a shuttered barbershop and a pawn store, smelling of motor oil, stale coffee, and rainwater. At night, Ethan slept in the small apartment behind the office, with one chair facing the door, and 3 locks he checked more often than he admitted. He was 46, broad through the shoulders, but lean in the way old pain can make a man lean. As if the body keeps burning fuel long after the fire should have gone out. His hair, once dark brown, had begun to gray at the temples. A scar ran along the base of his left thumb, pale and rope-thin, from a night in Afghanistan when he had held pressure on a boy's wound while mortar fire walked closer through the dust. People sometimes asked if he had been a doctor. Ethan always said no. He had been a combat medic, which meant he had learned how to keep men breathing in places where breathing felt like an argument with God. He did not tell war stories. Men at the garage tried once or twice, usually around Veterans Day, with good intentions and awkward voices. Ethan would give a small nod, wipe his hands on a rag, and disappear under the hood of an old engine until the moment passed. Words like trauma, healing, closure, support group, they all sounded too polished to him, too clean around the edges. He trusted things that did not pretend to be more than they were. A working flashlight, a sharp pocket knife, a locked door, the weight of a wrench in his palm, and the slow, steady breathing of Rook beside his bed. Rook was 8 years old, a sable German shepherd with dark fur along his back, amber eyes, and one torn ear that gave him a look of permanent, quiet judgment. Before Ethan, Rook had belonged to a county search and rescue team. He had worked flood zones, mudslides, and collapsed houses after storms tore through the Appalachian hills. He had found people trapped under brush, an old man pinned beneath a fallen porch, and once, in a church basement filled with brown water, a woman still alive because Rook refused to leave the door. Then came the landslide near Logan County. A wall of mud shifted without warning. Rook survived, but his handler did not. After that, the dog stopped working. Or maybe, as one trainer told Ethan, Rook kept working, but stopped believing people knew how to listen. Ethan met him through a Veterans Assistance Program on a February afternoon when he himself was not exactly trying to live. The night before, he had driven to the Patrick Street Bridge and sat there with the engine running, hands on the wheel, hearing gunfire that was not there. He had not planned anything clearly. That was the part that scared him later. He had only wanted the noise to stop. The next day, a counselor with tired eyes placed Rook's leash in his hand. The dog looked up at him, studied him for a long second, then leaned his whole weight against Ethan's leg, as if they had both been standing too long. Ethan hated pity. He could feel it from across a room, and it made his skin tighten. But Rook did not pity him. Rook simply stayed. In the mornings, before Ethan could sink too far into the gray silence that waited beside the bed, the shepherd would push open the door with his nose and place his muzzle on Ethan's hand. Not begging, not demanding, just reminding. There was food to pour into a bowl, a walk to take, a creature on earth who expected him to get up. That was how Rook saved him. Not with miracles, not with speeches, but with the stubborn holiness of needing him. Ethan did not trust many people. Trust, to him, was a bridge that had burned behind too many uniforms, too many hospitals, too many folded flags. But he trusted Rook with the small, hidden parts of himself, the shaking after thunder, the way he stood in grocery aisles, counting exits, the names he whispered when sleep dragged him backward. Rook rarely barked. That was what everyone noticed. Delivery drivers, customers, even Bill Mercer would say, "That dog's got an old soul." Ethan never corrected them. Rook did not bark because he was not careless with alarm. He watched first, listened, waited, and when he finally made a sound, Ethan had learned to pay attention. Rook had spent his life finding people others had missed, and Ethan had learned not to ignore him when the dog went still. The letter came on a November morning that seemed too tired to become day. Rain hung over Charleston in a thin gray sheet, dripping from power lines, darkening the brick walls, turning the alley behind Mercer's garage into a shallow stream of oil-colored water. Ethan Walker was bent over the open hood of a 1978 Ford F-150, one hand buried deep near the alternator, the other holding a wrench slick with grease. The truck belonged to a retired coal hauler who swore it ran better when spoken to kindly, so Ethan had been talking to it under his breath for 20 minutes. Not words exactly, just low sounds, the kind men make when silence presses too close. Inside the garage, the air smelled of cold coffee, wet metal, motor oil, and old rubber. Rook lay near the half-open bay door, his sable coat shadowed by the dull morning light, eyes half closed, ears moving at every passing tire, every footstep, every far-off siren. He looked asleep to anyone who didn't know him. Ethan knew better. Rook was never fully asleep. Neither was he. The mailman didn't come inside. He never did. He only appeared at the edge of the bay, rain dripping from the bill of his cap, and called, "Walker?" Ethan slid out from under the hood and wiped his hands on a red shop rag. "That's me." The mailman handed him a white envelope protected in a plastic sleeve, certified. "Looks official." Ethan glanced at the return address and felt something quiet tighten behind his ribs. Brennan and Pike Attorneys at Law. Hollow Creek, West Virginia. He had not heard the name Hollow Creek spoken in years, but it still carried a smell in his memory. Damp leaves, wood smoke, church basement coffee, and the faint powdery scent of an old woman's sweater. He signed the slip. The mailman left. The rain filled the space where he had been. Ethan stood for a moment with the envelope in his hand while the Ford ticked and cooled beside him. Rook raised his head. Not much. Just enough. "Probably nothing," Ethan said. The dog did not blink. In the small office, Ethan opened the envelope with the edge of his pocket knife. The paper inside was thick, formal, and cold in the way legal paper always seemed cold, as if grief had been typed by someone wearing gloves. "Dear Mr. Walker, we regret to inform you of the passing of Miss Clara Whitcomb, age 70, of Hollow Creek, West Virginia." Ethan read the sentence once. Then again, Clara. The name did not land like sorrow. It landed like a door, somewhere in the back of his life clicking open. She had been his grandmother, or at least that was the story Ethan had grown up with. Ruth had been told Clara was a relative from Ethan's birth family, a distant grandmother from the Whitcomb side, and Ethan had accepted that explanation, because some family doors stay locked until someone finally hands you the key. He remembered Clara in fragments, not whole scenes. Cold hands wrapped around a chipped mug. A soft voice that trembled even when she asked if he wanted more pie. A woman standing behind lace curtains as his adoptive parents' car pulled away. Once, years ago, he had come back unexpectedly and seen Clara through the window, holding an old photograph of him against her chest, crying without making a sound. When he asked about it later, his adoptive mother, Ruth, had looked away and said, "Clara wasn't cold, Ethan. She was scared." He had never asked what Clara had been scared of. People learn not to question locked doors when the adults in their lives guard them long enough. The letter said Clara had died of a stroke 3 weeks earlier. It said she had left him a cabin outside Hollow Creek and a small strip of land near Coal Run Ridge. It said Brennan and Pike would handle transfer of ownership at his convenience. Ethan almost folded the letter right there. He had no use for a cabin, no use for Hollow Creek, no use for ghosts wearing family names. Then he saw the final paragraph. Mrs. Whitcomb left specific instructions that the property must not be sold, transferred, demolished, or altered until you have spent 1 full night inside the cabin. Ethan stared at that line until the rain against the window seemed to grow louder. "1 night," he muttered. "Why would you care about 1 night?" Rook stood. Slowly, the shepherd crossed the office, lowered his nose to the envelope, and sniffed along the seam where the lawyer's seal had been pressed. Then his body went still. A low growl moved through him, not angry, not wild, but warning. Ethan felt the hairs rise along his own arms. "What is it?" Rook looked toward the door as if the road to Hollow Creek had already found them. Ethan wanted to ignore it. He wanted to go back to the Ford, back to the honest language of bolts and belts and engines that only failed for reasons a man could see. But Clara's trembling voice had come back to him. So had Ruth's words. She was scared. By noon, Ethan had folded the letter into his jacket pocket. By dusk, he had packed a duffel bag, a flashlight, his old field knife, and enough dog food for 2 days. He told Bill Mercer he had some family business. Bill studied him for a second, then only nodded. Good men knew when not to ask. As Ethan locked the garage, Rook climbed into the passenger seat of the truck before being told. Rain slid down the windshield. The city lights blurred behind them. Ethan started the engine and looked east, toward the mountains, toward Hollow Creek, toward a dead woman's last instruction. He did not know then that Clara had not asked for 1 night because she wanted him to remember her. She had asked because 1 night was all the cabin needed to begin telling the truth. Hollow Creek appeared just after noon, tucked between 2 ridge lines like something placed there carefully and then forgotten. The rain had thinned to a mist by the time Ethan Walker's truck rolled past the town sign, its painted letters faded but still trying to look cheerful. "Welcome to Hollow Creek, West Virginia, where neighbors still know your name." Beneath it, someone had tied a small American flag to the post, the cloth wet and clinging to itself. Ethan slowed without meaning to. Rook sat upright in the passenger seat, nose lifted toward the cracked window, ears working. The town looked harmless at first glance, almost painfully so. White church steeple above the trees, brick storefronts with striped awnings, a diner with steam fogging its front glass. Porches lined with rocking chairs, pumpkins gone soft from the weather, and flags that had seen too many winters. There was a veterans memorial near the courthouse lawn, black stone polished clean, names carved deep beneath an eagle with spread wings. Ethan noticed that first. Men like him always did. Past the memorial stood a banner stretched between 2 lampposts. "Thank you, Russell Vance, for rebuilding Hollow Creek." Ethan drove under it and felt Rook shift beside him. "Yeah," he muttered. "I saw it too. The diner was called May's Table, and it smelled like bacon grease. Burnt coffee and apple pie when Ethan stepped inside. A bell over the door rang once. Conversations did not stop all at once. That would have been too obvious. They died in pieces. A laugh at the counter faded. A spoon paused against a mug. 2 men in work jackets lowered their voices without looking at him. Ethan had felt rooms change before. In Afghanistan, silence could mean an ambush. In America, he had learned silence could mean judgment. Rook stayed close to his left leg. calm but alert. The waitress, a woman in her 30s with tired eyes and a pencil behind one ear, came over with a menu. "You passing through?" she asked. "Hear about a property," Ethan said. "Cabin out near Coal Run Ridge. Belonged to Clara Whitcomb." The pencil slipped slightly from behind her ear. She caught it fast, but not fast enough. At the far end of the counter, an old man in a brown cap looked up sharply, stared at Ethan's face, then bent over his coffee as if prayer had suddenly become urgent. The waitress's smile stayed on, but something in it had locked. "Clara's place," she said. "Not a question?" Ethan almost said no. The word rose naturally, bitter and easy. Instead, he said, "I'm handling the estate." Her eyes moved to Rook, then back to him. "Road gets rough past the church. Watch the washout near Miller's Bend." She tore a page from her order pad and drew a quick map with hands that had begun to tremble. When Ethan thanked her, she leaned in just enough that only he could hear. "Some folks around here don't like old business." Then she straightened. Louder now. "Coffee?" Ethan nodded. The coffee was burnt and bitter, but Ethan drank it anyway. While he sat there, he saw Russell Vance's name 3 more times. On a Little League photograph, on a hospital fundraiser flyer, on a plaque beside the cash register, thanking Vance Development for restoring downtown after the flood of 2015. The flood was everywhere once Ethan started looking. A framed newspaper clipping showed brown water swallowing porches along the creek. Another showed volunteers carrying sandbags. One photograph showed Russell Vance in a clean jacket, one hand resting on the shoulder of a flood survivor, staring into the camera with the grave kindness of a man who understood exactly how useful kindness could look. Underneath, the caption read, "Local builder leads $600,000 relief effort." Ethan studied the number. $600,000. Enough to rebuild a street if spent honestly. Enough to buy silence if spent carefully. He did not know why that thought came to him, and he disliked how naturally it did. The old man at the counter stood suddenly, coins rattling under his palm. As he passed Ethan's table, he whispered without moving his lips much, "Leave Clara buried." Then he walked out into the mist. Rook gave one low sound in his chest. Ethan turned, but no one in the diner looked surprised. That was the part that chilled him, not the warning. The practiced way everyone pretended not to hear it. Outside, Hollow Creek went on looking beautiful. Church bell, wet sidewalks, flags, mountains rising blue and solemn beyond the rooftops. But as Ethan drove toward Coal Run Ridge, he understood that this town did not feel dangerous because people might attack him. It felt dangerous because everyone had already survived something together, and survival had taught them to keep their mouths shut. Somewhere in that silence, Clara Whitcomb had left him a cabin. And maybe, Ethan thought as Rook stared hard through the windshield, she had left him the one thing Hollow Creek feared more than death: a reason to speak. The road to Clara Whitcomb's cabin narrowed after the old church, turning from cracked asphalt to red clay that sucked at Ethan's tires and held the rain in long, rust-colored scars. The church itself stood abandoned near the bend, its white paint peeled down to gray wood, its bell tower leaning slightly, as if it had grown tired of calling people who no longer wanted to answer. Rook watched it through the passenger window until the truck passed, then turned his head toward the trees. The cabin waited at the end of the road, smaller than Ethan expected, half hidden behind wet pines and mountain laurel, with a rusted tin roof, a sagging porch, and windows clouded by dust. It did not look haunted. That would have been easier. It looked patient. Ethan parked, sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel, and listened to the engine tick itself quiet. "One night," he said. Rook gave no response, only stepped down into the mud when Ethan opened the door and stood facing the house as if remembering something Ethan had never known. Inside, the cabin smelled of cedar, soot, old paper, and the faint sweetness of dried lavender. The floorboards complained under Ethan's boots. A wood stove sat cold in the corner. A quilt was folded over the back of a chair with such care that it made the room feel less abandoned than interrupted. Ethan had come with a simple plan. Check for leaks, make sure the place was safe, sleep because the dead woman had asked it of him, then sign whatever papers let him sell it and return to Charleston. But Clara's cabin resisted simplicity. The first thing he noticed was the labels. Every box had one. Photographs, 1998 to 2004. Receipts, medical, food, blankets, flood articles, official statements, church records, copies. Drawers were arranged by year. Newspaper clippings had been cut straight and stacked in envelopes. Grocery receipts were paper-clipped to handwritten notes. Even the pantry shelves held rows of jars dated in Clara's narrow script, though most had long since gone bad. This was not clutter, it was not old age. It was evidence kept by someone who did not trust memory to survive what people wanted buried. In a kitchen cabinet, behind chipped plates and a tin of stale tea, Ethan found 3 loose birthday cards tied with blue string. His name was on each envelope, written in Clara's careful hand across years she had never been allowed to claim. None had been mailed. He opened one with careful fingers. The card showed a cartoon dog wearing a party hat. Inside, Clara had written, "I hope you laughed today. I heard something good happened for you. I wish I had been there to see it." It was signed only, C, not Grandma Clara. Not love. Clara. Just C, as if even ink had rules she was afraid to break. Ethan stared at the card until the words softened at the edges. He set it down gently, the way a man sets down something alive. Evening came early under the trees. By 6, rain struck the roof hard enough to blur every other sound. Then the power failed with a click, and the cabin sank into black. Ethan built a fire, more for light than warmth, and sat near the hearth with Clara's papers spread across the coffee table. Rook had been restless since dusk, pacing from room to room, nose low, ears forward. At first Ethan ignored him. Old wood-held mice. Squirrels found ways into walls. But then Rook stopped beside the fireplace. His body tightened. A low growl moved through him. "It's probably mice, boy," Ethan said. Rook scratched once at a warped board near the hearth. Then again, then harder, claws biting into the wood with such frantic purpose that Ethan rose. "Rook, stop!" The dog did not stop. He clawed until one nail split, leaving a thin red streak on the floor. That changed something in Ethan. He knelt, ran his hand over the board, and felt the slight lift along one edge. His pulse slowed in the old way, the dangerous way, when fear became focus. He slid the tip of his knife beneath the raised edge and lifted slowly, as if the floor itself might decide whether to give up its secret. The board groaned loose. Beneath it was a hollow lined with black plastic. Inside lay a metal box wrapped in waterproof cloth and tied with a cracked leather strap. Rook backed away and sat, trembling. Ethan opened the box by firelight. Inside was a ledger filled with Clara's handwriting. Columns of names and dollar amounts, marked after the 2015 flood. There was a hospital bracelet reading Infant Male Whitcomb, September 1980. There was a burned photograph of Clara in a hospital bed, holding someone small against her chest, the face cut away. There was a list of 23 families, and beside them the same sentence repeated. Promised help, never received it. At the bottom lay a thick envelope. On the front, Clara had written, "Do not open first. Find Miriam Hale." Ethan sat back on his heels. Rain hammered the roof. Firelight moved across the walls like something trying to escape. Rook pressed his shoulder against Ethan's side, warm, shaking, loyal. Ethan looked around the little cabin then, at the labeled boxes, the clipped articles, the unsent cards, and understood with a coldness deeper than fear that Clara had not left him a house. She had left him a case file disguised as a life. By morning, the rain had stopped, but Hollow Creek still looked wet all the way through, as if the town itself had been left out overnight and forgotten. Ethan drove down from Clara's cabin with the metal box on the seat behind him and Rook beside him, silent, watchful, one bandaged paw resting against the dashboard. The name on the envelope had stayed with Ethan through what little sleep he managed: Miriam Hale. Find Miriam Hale, not the sheriff, not the lawyer, not Russell Vance, a librarian. The Hollow Creek Public Library sat across from the courthouse in a brick building, with ivy crawling up one side, and a faded mural of books beneath a painted oak tree. Inside it of dust, floor wax, and old pages, the kind of smell that made every whisper feel important. A woman behind the front desk looked up before the bell above the door had finished ringing. She was small and straight-backed, with silver-threaded hair pulled into a loose knot, reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. For one breath, she only stared. Then her face changed in a way Ethan could not name. Grief passing through recognition, recognition passing through fear. "You have her eyes," she said quietly. "God help you." Ethan felt Rook shift against his leg. "Miriam Hale?" "Depends who's asking." "Ethan Walker." Her hand moved to the desk, gripping the edge, not hard enough to show panic, just hard enough to stay standing. She looked past him to the windows, then toward the history room in the back. "Come with me." Miriam did not speak again until they were behind a closed door surrounded by filing cabinets, microfilm boxes, and newspaper archives stacked in careful rows. Only then did she sit, fold both hands on the table, and look at the metal box Ethan placed between them. "She hid it under the floor, didn't she?" Ethan's throat tightened. "You knew?" "I knew Clara never threw truth away. She only hid it where cowards wouldn't think to look." Miriam opened the ledger, but did not touch the hospital bracelet. Her eyes softened when she saw it, then hardened almost instantly, the way people do when tenderness is too dangerous to keep visible. She told him Clara had volunteered after the 2015 flood, first at the church, then with the relief committee. She helped families file claims after the flood and believed paperwork could protect people. Then the forms began changing. Signatures appeared from people who swore they had signed nothing. Families marked as helped were still sleeping in cars. 23 names, Ethan thought. Promised help, never received it. Miriam turned a page in the ledger and tapped Russell Vance's company name with one thin finger. She found the pattern. Vance Development billed the relief fund for materials that never arrived, repairs that were never made, houses that were never built. Why didn't she go to the police? Ethan asked, though he already knew the answer before Miriam looked at him. Because the police chief's brother-in-law worked for Vance. Because the council owed him money. Because the church liked his checks. Because poor people can tell the truth all day long and still lose to a rich man's smile. Her voice trembled then, but she did not stop. Clara had planned to take everything to a state newspaper in Charleston. 2 days before she left, rumors started. Clara was unstable. Clara had stolen from the fund. Clara had a history of depression. Clara had a child out of wedlock and no husband to speak for her. No one needed proof to hate a poor woman, Miriam said. They only needed a story that made them feel clean while doing it. Ethan looked down at the bracelet. Infant male Whitcomb. The room seemed to press inward. Who can confirm this? Miriam hesitated. Caleb Rusk. He led rescue crews during the flood. He saw more than most. They say he's confused now. She met Ethan's eyes. They call him confused because it's easier than admitting he remembers. Pine Mercy Home sat at the edge of town behind a row of bare sycamores. Caleb Rusk was in room 114, a thin old man swallowed by a plaid robe, his hands curled on the arms of his wheelchair. At first, he stared past Ethan as if watching rain no one else could see. Then Rook stepped into the room. Caleb's mouth opened. His eyes filled. "Shepherd," he whispered. Rook walked to him and rested his head gently on the old man's knee. Caleb began to cry, one hand shaking over the dog's torn ear. "One pulled my Annie from the water." She was barely breathing, but that dog wouldn't let go. Ethan knelt and showed him the bracelet. Caleb took it like a communion wafer. His fingers closed around it, and for one clear second, age lifted from his face. "Clara," he breathed. "Poor Clara." "What happened to her?" Ethan asked. Caleb looked at him then, truly looked, and something like pity moved through his clouded eyes. "She gave up her name," he said, voice breaking. "So you could keep yours." Ethan waited, but the old man turned back toward the window. The moment gone, the bracelet still clutched in his hand like a secret too heavy to release. At the door, Caleb's nurse hurried after Ethan and pressed the bracelet back into his palm, whispering that Caleb had asked him to carry it, where Clara could no longer go. After Ethan started asking questions, Hollow Creek did not become louder. It became quieter in a way that felt deliberate. The town still opened its shops in the morning. May's table still served biscuits with sausage gravy. The bell at the downtown church still rang at noon, though Ethan never saw anyone go inside. But wherever he went, conversations thinned as he approached, then stitched themselves back together after he passed. At the diner, a man in a seed company cap leaned toward another and whispered, "That's Clara's boy," just loud enough for Ethan to hear. When Ethan turned, both men lowered their eyes to their plates, chewing with the exaggerated innocence of children caught stealing. Outside the hardware store, a woman he had never met crossed the street rather than share the sidewalk with him. At the gas station, the clerk smiled until Ethan asked if she knew Russell Vance. Then her smile vanished so completely it was like a light going out behind glass. By the third night, the black pickup appeared. It parked beyond the last bend before Clara's cabin, far enough to claim coincidence, close enough to be seen. No headlights, no movement, just a dark shape sitting under the pines while rainwater slid down its windshield. Ethan watched it from the porch with one hand inside his jacket and Rook standing beside him, still as a carved shadow. "We see you," Ethan muttered. The truck did not move. The next morning his phone rang at 5:12. Unknown number. He answered and heard only breathing, faint and slow, buried beneath static. "Who is this?" he said. The call ended. It happened again at noon, then twice after dark, no words. Just the suggestion of someone close enough to listen and patient enough not to speak. Ethan told himself it was intimidation, not danger. He had known danger. Danger had heat, noise, direction. This was different. This was fog poured into the room. It got inside him. By Friday, he caught himself checking the window latches 6 times before bed. He hated that. He hated that they had found a way to make an old habit feel like proof against him. That night, Rook growled at the back door. It was a low sound, almost swallowed in his chest, but Ethan was on his feet before the second breath. He took the flashlight and opened the door slowly. Cold air pushed in, the beam swept over wet steps, mud, woodpile, trees. Then it stopped. Hanging from the back doorknob was an old baby doll, its plastic face cracked down one cheek, its yellow hair dark with rain. A red cord had been tied around its neck. Tucked beneath the cord was a note sealed in a sandwich bag. Ethan pulled it free. The message was written in black marker. Some graves should stay closed. For a moment the woods seemed to lean closer. Rook stepped in front of him, teeth showing now, body between Ethan and the dark. Ethan took the doll, the note and the call log to Sheriff Dale Corbin the next morning. Corbin was 55, broad-bellied, silver-haired, with the careful politeness of a man who had spent years learning how to say no without raising his voice. He listened, nodded, looked at the note, then looked at Ethan's service record on the desk as if it had wandered there by accident. "You've been through a lot overseas," Corbin said gently. "Sometimes old houses make men hear things." Ethan stared at him. The words were soft. That was why they cut so deep. A threat would have been easier. A threat had honesty in it. This was worse. This took the part of him that had survived explosions, blood loss, screaming men, and years of sleep that never fully became sleep, and used it to make him smaller, unsteady, unreliable, not a witness, not a son. Just a damaged veteran in a dead woman's house. Ethan left before he said something that would prove Corbin right in the eyes of men like him. Back at the cabin, he nearly packed. He pulled the duffel from the closet and threw in 2 shirts, his shaving kit, the ledger, the bracelet. His hands moved hard and fast, anger hiding the fear underneath. Rook watched from the bedroom doorway, then turned and walked to Clara's bed. He nosed under the mattress, pawed once and looked back. Ethan exhaled sharply. Rook pawed again. Ethan lifted the mattress. Beneath it was a flat cedar box. Inside were the rest of the birthday cards, 18 of them, tied with blue ribbon. One for every year Clara had been forced to love him from a distance. None mailed. His hand slowed. He opened one near the top. Clara's handwriting filled the inside. "I saw you today. You looked strong, but I knew that look. I wanted to run to you. I didn't. I am sorry." Ethan sat down on the floor because his legs had forgotten their duty. He opened another. "You looked at me once like you thought I never loved you. I deserved that, but it still broke me." The room blurred. Rook came close and laid his head against Ethan's knee. Ethan touched the dog's torn ear, barely breathing. Clara had not been distant because she had forgotten him. She had been near, watching, counting birthdays, keeping grief in boxes, loving him from behind glass. Ethan looked at the packed duffel, then at the cards spread across the floor like years returned too late. Outside, the black pickup was gone, but Hollow Creek's silence remained, pressing against the windows. Ethan no longer wanted to run from it. He wanted to know what kind of town could make a mother love her child from across the room and call that mercy. The fire began with a smell Ethan knew too well. Not smoke first, gasoline, sharp, oily, wrong. He was at Clara's kitchen table, with the ledger opened beneath the yellow circle of a battery lantern, following a line of payments from the 2015 Relief Fund to Vance Development, then to subcontractors Clara had circled, because no one in town seemed to know they existed. Outside, the wind moved through the pines in long, wet breaths. Rook had been lying near the stove, chin on his paws, but suddenly his head snapped up. His ears stood high. His body went still in that terrible way Ethan had learned to trust. "What is it?" Ethan whispered. Rook did not growl this time. He exploded toward the back of the cabin, claws skidding across the floorboards, barking so hard the sound cracked. Ethan rose, one hand reaching for the flashlight, and that was when the smell hit him, gasoline. A second later, light bloomed beneath the kitchen door. Orange, moving, hungry. "Rook, back!" Ethan grabbed the metal box, shoved the ledger inside, then swept the hospital bracelet, the burned photograph, and the birthday cards he had been reading from the table with both hands. Heat pressed through the rear wall like an animal waking up. The window above the sink flashed bright, and the old curtains caught fire with a soft whoosh that was almost gentle. Then the room filled with smoke. Ethan moved on instinct, the old medic part of him rising before fear could. Low to the floor, cover the mouth, find the exit, count what matters. Rook was what mattered. The box was what mattered. Clara's cards were what mattered in a way he could not explain. not even to himself. He tucked the bundle under his jacket and kicked at the front door, but the warped wood stuck. Behind him, something in the kitchen burst, showering sparks across the ceiling. Rook barked once, then threw his weight against the lower panel as Ethan kicked again. The latch tore loose. Cold air rushed in. They stumbled onto the porch, smoke rolling after them like a black hand. Ethan dropped the box in the mud and turned back. The cards. Some had spilled, some were still inside. A lifetime of a woman loving him in silence, and he could not leave it to burn. He lunged toward the doorway, but Rook caught his sleeve in his teeth. "Let go!" Ethan shouted. The dog pulled harder, his paws digging into the wet boards. Inside, a beam cracked overhead. Ethan yanked free and took one step. The porch roof groaned, then collapsed in a roar of sparks and rotten timber. Rook hit him from the side, knocking him backward into the mud, just as burning wood crashed where he had been standing. For a moment, Ethan could not breathe. Rain struck his face. Smoke scraped his throat. Rook stood over him, trembling, teeth still bared toward the fire as if he could fight it by hatred alone. Ethan stared at the dog, stunned by the simple, brutal truth of it. He had spent years believing he had to save everything that screamed. Tonight, Rook had saved him from dying for what was already gone. By the time the volunteer fire truck arrived, the back half of the cabin was blackened, the kitchen gutted, the porch broken open like a rib cage. Men moved through steam and ash with axes and hoses, saying little. Ethan sat on a stump with a blanket over his shoulders, one hand buried in Rook's fur, the other gripping the metal box so tightly his knuckles ached. Sheriff Corbin arrived late, of course. Russell Vance did not appear at all. Near dawn, after the firefighters left and the cabin hissed in the rain, Rook pulled away from Ethan and limped toward the burned side wall. "Rook," Ethan called, voice raw. The shepherd ignored him and began pawing at a section of collapsed plaster near the bedroom corner. Not frantic now, careful, certain. Ethan followed, coughing as he knelt in the ash. Beneath a charred board was a small tin container, blackened by fire but intact. He pried it open with shaking hands. Inside lay an old microcassette, wrapped in foil and half of a photograph. Clara was younger in the picture, pale and exhausted in a hospital bed, holding someone small against her chest. The face was turned away, pressed close to her gown. Ethan turned the photo over. Most of the writing had burned away, but one line remained clear enough to wound. "My son, Ethan. They let me hold him for 7 minutes." The world narrowed to that sentence. "Not grandson, son." Rook pressed against him, warm amid the cold ash. Ethan reached into the metal box and took out the envelope Clara had told him not to open first. This time, there was no one left to find, no warning left to obey. He broke the seal. Behind the letter was a certified copy of his original birth certificate, folded so many times the creases had turned soft. The letter inside was long, written in Clara's careful hand. The first line stopped him harder than the fire ever had. "I was never your grandmother." Ethan read the letter in the front seat of his truck, wrapped in a firefighter's blanket, while dawn pressed weakly through the burned ribs of Clara Whitcomb's cabin, and Rook lay close enough that their shoulders touched. The paper smelled faintly of smoke now, but beneath it there was another scent, old cedar, dried lavender, and thyme. Clara's handwriting was careful, almost painfully neat, as if she had believed that if she shaped every letter properly, the truth might hurt him less. It did not. "I was never your grandmother," the letter began. Ethan stopped there the first time. His eyes moved over the sentence, but his mind refused it, the way a body refuses cold water before the plunge. Rook lifted his head, watching him with those amber eyes that seemed to understand grief before it had language. Ethan swallowed and kept reading. Clara wrote that she had given birth to him in September of 1980, when she was 24 years old, unmarried, exhausted, and poorer than she had ever admitted to anyone. She worked mornings at a laundry off Route 17, afternoons keeping books for the church, and nights sewing hems for women who paid her in cash and casseroles. She had no husband, no savings, and no respectable story for a town that loved respectable stories, but she had him. "You had a red mark near your left shoulder," she wrote. "I remembered it, because it was the first thing about you the world had not managed to take from me." Ethan's hand drifted, without thought, to the faint birthmark beneath his shirt. For 46 years that mark had meant nothing. Now it felt like a fingerprint left by a woman who had been forced to love him from a distance. Clara wrote about the depression that came after he was born, the kind people whispered about instead of helping. Some days she could not eat. Some mornings she cried because she loved him so much it frightened her. She asked for help once, then learned what Hollow Creek did with weakness. It filed it away for later. Still, she held on. She worked. She saved what proof she could. She loved him in every way they still allowed. The first wound came in 1981, when Hollow Creek decided a poor, unmarried young mother with depression was easier to judge than to help. They said Clara was unstable. They said Clara was too unstable, too poor, and too alone to be trusted with motherhood. That was when they gave her the choice no mother should ever have to face. If she fought, they told her, Ethan would be taken from her while she tried to prove she was stable enough, decent enough, and rich enough to be believed. If she signed, Ruth and Paul Walker could adopt him quietly, and Clara would be allowed to remain nearby under a lie. A distant grandmother from the Whitcomb side. Harmless, watched, permitted, but never free. Decades later came the flood of 2015, and with it the second wound. Clara joined the relief committee because she understood forms, numbers, and the quiet panic of people who did not know how to ask for help without shame. She recorded who needed medicine, who had lost a roof, and who had nowhere safe to sleep. The fund had raised almost $600,000, enough, Clara wrote, to keep old men warm, to put widows under dry ceilings, to buy insulin, formula, lumber, blankets, dignity. But the numbers began lying. Payments moved toward companies Clara could trace back to Russell Vance. Though every name on paper seemed designed to look ordinary, invoices doubled. Signatures appeared from people who had never touched a pen. When Clara confronted him, Vance smiled and told her poor women should be careful with accusations. When she gathered proof, the smile vanished. Then they did not just threaten her. They erased her again. They said she had stolen from the fund. They said a woman with Clara's past had no right accusing respectable men over paperwork. In 1981, they had used her depression to claim she could not be trusted with motherhood. In 2015, they used that same old wound to claim she could not be trusted with money or truth. This time, Ethan was grown. This time, no one could use custody to threaten her, but they could still use her past to make the town stop listening. "I did not abandon you," she wrote. "I stood close enough to watch you grow, and far enough so they would not punish you for being mine." Ethan bent over the letter then, not crying loudly, not breaking apart the way people do in movies. It was worse than that. His face went still, his breath came shallow. His whole life seemed to tilt, and in that tilt he saw every memory differently. Clara behind curtains, Clara's cold hands pulling away, Clara's eyes shining at his graduation from the back row, Clara reaching for his face and stopping herself before love became evidence. She had not been cold. She had been starving herself of motherhood so he could eat, sleep, learn, grow, survive. Ethan pressed the letter to his chest, and the sound that left him was small, almost childlike. Rook rose and pushed his head beneath Ethan's chin. Ethan held him with one arm and the letter with the other, surrounded by smoke, ash, and the truth of a woman who had been called broken because broken people were easier to silence. For the first time, Ethan understood that poverty had not made Clara less worthy. Depression had not made her less honest. Shame had not made her less of a mother. Hollow Creek had taken her name because it could not take her love. And love, hidden under floors, tucked inside birthday cards, sealed in letters, had waited all these years for her son to come home. Ethan knew how to hurt a man. That was the truth he did not like carrying. But it lived in him all the same, tucked behind training, muscle memory, and years of being told where to place his hands when life was leaving a body. He played the tape once in his truck before sunrise, with Rook pressed against his leg and Clara's letter open on the seat beside him. After the fire, after Clara's letter, after Russell Vance's voice slid through the static like a snake in Sunday shoes, something dark and simple rose in him. He could drive to Vance's White House on the hill. He could make him afraid. For one burning hour, revenge felt almost clean. Then Rook laid his head on Clara's letter, right over the line where she had written, "I did not abandon you," and Ethan understood what she had been asking of him all along. Not violence, witness. A week later, the basement of the downtown Methodist church, filled with people who had spent years pretending Clara Whitcomb's name did not still hurt. Miriam Hale had called the state paper in Charleston. Caleb Rusk had insisted on coming, though his hands shook so badly Miriam had to button his coat. Families came down the basement stairs slowly, some out of courage, some out of shame, some because secrets have a gravity of their own. Ethan stood near the front with Rook at his side and Clara's metal box on the pulpit. Inside were the ledger, the forged invoices, the list of 23 families, the unsent birthday cards, the burned photograph, the certified copy of his original birth certificate Clara had folded behind her final letter, and the microcassette wrapped in foil like something sacred. Russell Vance came last. He wore a navy coat, polished shoes, and the tired smile of a man accustomed to being forgiven before he confessed. Sheriff Dale Corbin stood near the back wall, arms folded, not quite brave enough to leave, and not honest enough to step forward. Vance let Ethan speak for less than a minute before raising his voice. "This man is a damaged veteran chasing ghosts." The words moved through the church like cold air. Ethan felt them land exactly where they were meant to, in the old wounds, the sleepless places, the parts of him people could point at and call unreliable. Rook shifted closer, calm as a sentry. Ethan did not shout, he did not step toward Vance. He only placed Clara's hospital bracelet beside the ledger and looked at the faces in the pews. "You used her depression to call her unstable. You used her poverty to call her greedy. You used her love for me to keep her quiet. But pain is not proof that someone is lying. Sometimes pain is proof that someone survived the truth no one moved." Then Miriam slid the microcassette into a small recorder and pressed play. Clara's voice filled the church, thin but steady, with terror and courage braided together. "My name is Clara Whitcomb. I did not steal from this town. I tried to protect it. And if I failed, let this be the one thing I still get right. My son deserves the truth." For a moment, Hollow Creek forgot how to whisper. Then an old widow stood and said she had signed no paper saying she received a house. A former miner said his name on the receipt was forged while he lay in the hospital. A woman with tired eyes said Clara had brought medicine to her family during the flood when no one else came. One by one, the silence broke, not like thunder, but like ice splitting under spring water. Within weeks, state investigators opened formal inquiry. Vance Development's records were subpoenaed. Sheriff Corbin was placed on administrative leave, pending review. Months later, the relief fund was reopened under public oversight, with every dollar posted where any citizen could see it. None of it brought Clara back. Ethan knew better than to ask justice to do the work of resurrection. But her name changed. That mattered. People stopped saying that woman. They said Clara. Some said it with shame. Some said it like prayer. Ethan did not sell the cabin. He rebuilt the burned rooms board by board, sometimes with Miriam bringing sandwiches, sometimes with Caleb sitting in the yard telling stories that wandered but always found Clara in the end. The nightmares did not vanish. Some nights Ethan still woke at 3 a.m. with his heart sprinting from a war no one else could hear. Thunder still made his breath catch. There were still mornings when disappearing felt easier than staying. But now a porch light waited for him. Rook slept near the door, and the house that had once hidden the truth opened itself to people the world had called too broken, too poor, too difficult, or too damaged to believe. Above the porch, Ethan hung a wooden sign, the Clara Whitcomb house, for those who were silenced before they were heard. Late that winter, as the first soft snow settled on the new floorboards, Ethan sat on the steps with Rook's gray muzzle resting against his boot. He placed a hand on the dog's head and whispered, "You found her, boy." But he knew Rook had found more than Clara. He had found a mother, a name, a buried mercy, and the part of Ethan that grief, war, and lies had not managed to take. Some houses are not haunted by the dead. They are kept alive by the love no one was allowed to name. If this story touched you, tell us which moment stayed with you most and where you're watching from tonight. Subscribe for more stories about loyalty, truth, and the courage that brings people home.